Hello, and welcome back to Nufti's Iran Uncovered podcast. I'm Andrew Khalili. I'm here with Behnam Ben Taleblu today. Behnam is a senior fellow at FDD, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. Behnam previously served as a research fellow and senior Iran analyst at FDD. He is a long-standing expert on a variety of Iran issues, specifically things like ballistic missiles. He recently testified in front of Congress at an extremely insightful panel. Great to have you here today, Behnam. Thanks for joining.
A pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me, Andrew, and great to be with the whole Nufti team.
Thanks. So we have a lot to go into today. I want to start with one less serious question. How is it possible that you have managed to stay off of social media, specifically Twitter?
Heroic flexibility, to borrow a phrase from Khamenei. No, I mean, unfortunately, it is a very useful tool. Prior to, I think, Elon Musk buying Twitter, you could use it for free. But there are ways to still kind of monitor a lot of the open source feeds and things that people from inside Iran are saying. There's no doubt that social media remains a very important tool, but in my view, also it's become something of a cesspool, particularly on the politics and policy side.
Well, I think your life is probably much better off for it. So congratulations.
I'm pretty sure I'm making up for losses on the other end.
Fair enough. Okay, so we can get into it. I think one thing that people definitely want to hear a lot about right now is the upcoming Iranian elections. We're unclear when this podcast will be released, but at this moment, there are 6 candidates still left. The election is on the 28th, in a couple weeks from now. I guess initial thoughts on the candidates and the conversation that's been going on around this election.
You know, Andrew, you and other Iranian Americans, and Nufti certainly knows well, these elections, or shall we say selections, are neither free nor fair. And for most of the duration of the most important voter in Iran, which is the man with the most powerful title, and title meant to be taken very literally, Supreme Leader, most of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's tenure, you've seen him use elections to drag not society, but the state to the really hard right, to consolidate his power, to make sure that he continues to be able to have power without much of the accountability. And that also that yesterday's insider can become today's outsider, to make sure that there's a smaller and smaller and smaller political circle. So, for example, the people that did not make it through the vetting process this time is the former Parliament Speaker Ali Larijani, former Chief of Staff to President Rouhani, Ishaq Jahangiri, and also former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. But 6 people did, all of them men, 5 of them ultra-hardliners, 1 token reformist. Half of these 6, 3 of them have been sanctioned by Western governments, 2 of them by Canada, 1 of them by the UK. There's a big empty gap as to what the U.S. can and should be doing here. But no matter who wins, the Iranian people, unfortunately, will be the losers. And Iran does have one and only one important voter, and that's the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. As you know, this was a electoral contest or selectoral contest foisted onto them by the sudden death of Iran's president, Ibrahim Raisi. Many in this town had talked about him as being a potential Supreme Leader candidate for when Iran's octogenarian Supreme Leader does pass. But now that there is this opportunity for the regime to continue his legacy or to contract and make it even more hardline, one's eyes should be on, I think, in Washington, one's eyes should be on the street and not the state, because it's quite clear in what direction ultimately Khamenei may want to go. But if the previous trend lines hold, the more often the protests, the lower the turnout. So one thing people should be looking at is the turnout rates, what is officially stated versus what you can glean from other sources. And then lastly, if this becomes a flashpoint for future protests, and what it means for that contest between the state and the street in that country.
Great points. Thank you for that. You mentioned future protests and the potential for a new crisis now with Raisi dead as a potential successor to Khamenei as Supreme Leader. So we can likely look forward to street protests when that eventually occurs, when Khamenei dies and when there's a succession crisis. A lot of what we have worked on together, Nufti and FDD, is on maximum support, providing support to the Iranian people at times like this when they are in the streets protesting. The last time people were on the streets protesting, during the Women Life Freedom protests after Mahsa Amini was killed, there's a lot that the United States did not do. Can we reflect a little bit on why the United States didn't do enough? And then we can get into what to do to prepare for this next round of potential mass unrest.
For sure. And let's zoom out for a little bit to get a better sense of the evolving pattern of street protest in Iran, because unless one has that context, unless policymakers are armed with this background, they are going to be caught flat-footed the next time. And it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when the next time you have major anti-regime protests across the country. So how did these things come about? First off, the Islamic Republic is 45 years old. As long as there's been an Islamic Republic, there has been some nature of social protest that's poured out onto the street and weaponizing the power of the street and the politics of the street against the state, which does not represent them. That has been something coterminous with the life of this regime itself. The second is this larger paradox. You have one of the most anti-American governments in the region. You have one of the most pro-American populations in the region. This is one paradox. The other is you have an Islamist and an authoritarian political system, and then you have a secular and a nationalist population that is looking for representative government. This is also something else that cannot hold. In previous rounds of street protests, you've had triggers that were distinctly political. The closure of a reformist newspaper in 1999 and the storming of a Tehran University campus, the stealing of an election away from a reformist candidate in 2009. Broadly, those were reformist protests that moved slowly into the anti-regime direction, but they were elements of a political faction within that system. After 2009, the overpromise and the underdelivery of the JCPOA, that 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the failures of the reform movement, and the ability of the hardliners to continue to contract the political system yielded what we really see today, which is a whole series of labor strikes, domestic protests, disenfranchisement, coming together and grabbing that political taboo, that third rail that you saw them grab in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, into 2023, and even into the present. The Women Life Freedom or the Zan Zendegi Azadi protests of 2022-23 were not the first protests of that year. You had almost 6 days of nationwide anti-regime protest triggered by economic crisis about 6 months before, in the spring of 2022, when you had price hikes of wheat staples, you had a new austerity budget pulled in by Raisi. So policymakers need to know that this social ground has been already cast, and that when the population in the past 2 or 3 decades used to turn out and try to participate and push for reform, they are done with that altogether. There's a slogan from 2018 that I think is very prescient here, which is Eslah talab usulgara dige tamam majera, or principalist or reformist principalist, the jig is up, or reformist principalist, the game is over. And the society is using street protests to push away from the system altogether, highlight the sharpness or the contrast of their differences. And because these differences are so sharp, and because there has been questions as to how can Western policy accentuate or reflect or support these differences while also trying to deal with all the things that come from the Islamic Republic, the missile threat, the drone threat, the nuclear threat, the regional threat, the terrorism threat, the transnational repression threat, the cyber threat, the massive human rights abuses, the regime's presence in a whole host of illicit financing and narco-trafficking and narco-terrorism. That unfortunately being able to do something about the street, which requires political will and political capital, has been downgraded. And that's precisely why you have seen Western governments, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, fare comparatively better than the U.S. has in the past, in 1999 and in 2009, but they have fared comparatively better because that was an exceptionally low bar. Something, for example, that happened in 2017 to 2019 was that the idea of the West, particularly America, supporting protesters wholeheartedly, rhetorically, emphatically, that was a sacred taboo. That was just one of the first things that the U.S. did that was useful. But if that remains the only thing that the U.S. will ever do to support the Iranian people, just to lend rhetorical support, that will be too little too late. Because there are multiple generations of Iran's best, brightest, and most importantly, bravest continuing to come out onto the street, and they will continue to get mowed down by a regime that is armed to the teeth, that is lethal, and that has every incentive to do everything it can to stay in power because it understands at this point that fundamentally there is no way to put lipstick on a pig. And in this sense, I do worry a great deal about Western policy that may try to instrumentally look at supporting the Iranian people and not do anything in practicality. I want to stress this for the Western policymaker. This is one of the few times in the Middle East where you have a marriage between your strategy and your values. And it would be an opportunity it would be a real mistake to miss such an opportunity.
Important points you brought up. I think, one very important one is there used to be, and there maybe still is, this belief amongst American policymakers that reform within the regime is possible. The Iranian public themselves, as you said, has shot that down to the point where there's been a narrative shift. And if you look at U.S. media reports, they acknowledge this shift. It's interesting now as we see as this reformist candidate in the election, and there's more talk from so-called Iran experts on how he might be able to change the regime, but even he in interviews is saying he won't be able to.
Just one quick point on the reform movement. Whatever your theory of the case, the outcome is the same. So there are two theories, which is that are they willing to go all the way? If Mousavi had the support of 3 million people in Tehran, the former prime minister who had the election taken from him in 2009 by Ahmadinejad and the security establishment, did he have the will to take it all the way or the capability? Either way, he did not take it all the way. The position of president is not a position or a springboard into future political prominence. Think of most of the presidents under Khamenei. They've had a falling out with the office of the president in their second term. All of them have been granted a second term because the regime does not like exogenous shocks. But this tying up in our own mind here in the Washington debate about, is there still a chance for reform? Is there still a chance for evolution? You don't have to take it from me. You don't have to take it from the other self-styled or whatnot Iran experts. Listen to the protests and to the chants coming out from the street against the state. Again, that line, Eslah talab usulgara dige tamam mujara. Look at the boycotts of these elections and look at the kind of candidates that the regime is putting forward. They're not even really deigning to try to put lipstick on a pig anymore. They have an agenda, and the agenda is to contract the political system, to make the available political space, which is exceptionally limited in that Islamist and authoritarian country, even more limited.
One of the other things you mentioned that is important shift in the conversation was when President Obama came out during these recent talks talking about the taboo that you mentioned about supporting protests, and said we made a mistake basically in 2009 in not supporting, or in the earlier protests when he was president, not supporting them. And that led to Biden's rhetorical support increasing much more. That's, as you said, it's the bare minimum. It's a very low bar to set, but that was an important shift.
I think Hillary Clinton also said something to that effect, right?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So all of that leads into, despite that shift, despite the Trump administration being clearly wanting to support the Iranian people in their efforts, obviously there wasn't such a mass unrest movement, but as you noted, these protest movements, whether it's teachers, farmers,
truck drivers, unionists, bazaris,
exactly,
merchants. There's a whole class of people that have been protesting like a kaleidoscope, like a mosaic. And you might not understand what is the farmer's demand, what is the environmentalist demand. But when you see people from different backgrounds and all different stripes of society who have different professional careers, being able to identify that the sore spot or the driver of their problems is not something technically tied up in their careers, but is a political issue emanating from national decision-making in Tehran, this is really, this is why there is a social tipping point post-2017. And that's why there is no going back. It may be a very, 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 very long run and a very bumpy run, but that's why, at least socially, this cannot be undone. This genie cannot be put back in the bottle. And that's why you've had the triggers for all of these protests from 2017 to present be economic, social, religious, foreign policy related, environmental related, but with all these diverse backgrounds and all these diverse triggers, the ask is the same. It's a political ask. And just as the U.S. has broken that taboo, starting in 2017, 2018, supporting them, the Iranians themselves in their slogans have broken the taboo. And one of the most consistent broken taboo chants you hear is not falling for this left and right and hardliner and reformist narrative, but it's to go to the heart of the matter, and it's the slogans against the supreme leader himself. It's the slogans against the son of the supreme leader, even ironically.
Yeah, the street protests and the slogans are incredibly revealing. doing. And I think we would encourage U.S. policymakers to listen to the Iranian people very closely.
Yeah, not that I would say don't listen to this podcast, but if U.S. policymakers have so little time, less than a minute, just go through, even on Twitter, even on that platform that I'm not on, go through and look at the evolution of slogans. You want to have your pulse on the street. You want to know what is being said. You know, you don't have to follow for one of these polls or another one of these polls where you have dubious methodologies. Just listen to what is being said. Take your cues from the street. And ironically, Washington will understand how far behind it has fallen on what a Iran policy that is realistically grounded looks like when they listen to the words coming out of the mouths of the Iranian people on the street. It's not about the JCPOA. It's not about 2015. It's not about reform. It's an entirely new reality.
So once policymakers understand this, I think we would agree the important step is what to do next and how to support the Iranian people. So Nufti and FDD for a little bit had their separate maximum support initiatives. The way we would describe it is a complement to the maximum pressure strategy. That was good. It was being effective. It was not enough to help the Iranian people achieve their goals of a new secular democratic Iran. Recently, we came together. We wrote a joint memo condensing maximum support into the most important tangible recommended policy proposals within the two reports. So we can get into that a little bit in this context of mass protests, what's coming up next, what the United States needs to prepare for. We can sort of go through one by one in the proposals, but we'll talk in a little bit in the abstract.
Well, just a little bit in the
Sure.
abstract, just so the listener and the viewer knows. Consider this kind of an e pluribus unum moment, an out of many one moment. You have a grassroots Iranian-American organization and an established Washington think tank singing from the same sheet of music and who had independently produced two documents coming to the same conclusion about the need for maximum support, being able to look at the facts on the ground in Iran as they are, rather than that which we may wish them to be, and then coming up with supporting policy prongs to help make what it is into something that we may want. And again, to engage in that marriage of strategy and values. Again, it's kind of hard in Washington to do the right thing and also do the strategic thing. So I consider this the first of a very helpful log rolling exercise that brings in many, many more. And that builds on good trend lines that we saw. For example, during the Trump administration, you saw not just a desire to go after, in particularly using sanctions, which is still a prong or an element of maximum support, even though one may think it's maximum pressure, being able to strategically use sanctions, particularly the lower level Treasury Department designations, to name and shame not just national officials who may have no direct role in the crackdown in some province far away from Tehran, but local level commanders. This was something we talked about in 2019, a stratified sanctions campaign that names and shames local level oppressors. And I want to shout out, Nufti has a report on this as well, going after judges, looking at local IRGC and police officials that have been supportive, either instrumentally or indirectly, or giving orders for, or after there's a crackdown, publicly coming out and praising that crackdown, to make sure that these people are held to account, that there is no freebie for anyone supporting the regime's repressive apparatus.
Navid, our former policy director, did a ton of work to collect those names and that information. And through the MASA Act, which was recently passed with your help and led by grassroots Iranian activists, we have now the ability to submit those names, which we were already doing through Congress. But we can submit those names to the chairman of either HFAC, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, or the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee to then be reviewed for sanctions. Can you talk a little bit about that? You know, there's a 60-day requirement and a 90-day requirement, what we can expect moving forward with the MASA Act and how that kind of ties into, I mean, you tied it in already, but how it ties into what we're...
Well, here I would just say, you know, the hell with me, this is really where the community, which again had been so divided for so long, really had a fundamentally clear ask of American policymakers. And this is the president creation moment for how do you gain political influence and political leverage. I'm not a political operator. I have my views, but they're really limited to myself. But watching the Iranian American community be able to do this from so many diverse backgrounds, generationally, demographically, geographically, political orientation-wise, to be able to come to the conclusion that, wait a second, the most powerful person in Iran who controls the livelihood of 85 plus million Iranians is not subject to Magnitsky corruption sanctions, is not subject to human rights sanctions. This is the person that's giving the go order. Remember how previously, a few moments ago, I talked about this regime understanding actually how unpopular it is and throwing in a cocktail of lethal force because it will do anything to survive. It will do literally anything to survive. It is engaging in the use of that cocktail of lethal force and the inability of Washington to call a spade a spade. In my view, if you can't even articulate the problem, if you don't have the context, how can you even go about addressing the problem? I recently heard this because Washington's approach to all of this stuff seems to be management rather than solution, which as much as I disagree, I get that because if you're not going to put in the politics, if you're not going to put in the capital, if you're not going to take the risks, and if you're not going to take the time, you're not going to be in the solving business, you're going to be in the managing business. And the maximum support, the 10-point plan, that kind of is a lowest common denominator way to move from management to solving. And the reason you want to move from management to solving, I was just at a book event listening to former CENTCOM Commander General McKinsey. He was doing a plug for his book, and he was talking about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And he ended up mentioning this management issue that Washington seems to have everywhere. And just to paraphrase him, he said, when you try to manage the problem ends up managing you. And that's precisely what we have here. It's the Islamic Republic's ability to survive, ability to use this cocktail of force against protesters, ability to reach abroad into Canada, into America, into the European Union, ability to sell its drones on 4 different continents, and now potentially even missiles, with that proliferation being further and wider than ever before, and get away with it. And the more they are able to get away with it, the next round of repression at home and aggression abroad is underwritten. So it's to be able to take this thing, which for too long was seen as a soft issue, as a human rights issue, and to bring that to the forefront of the national security discussion that the United States has about the Islamic Republic of Iran.
I think a clear example of how managing the problem has turned into the problem managing us can be seen in Iran's nuclear program over the last few years.
Oh my goodness.
They're now, at nuclear breakout point because of what you're saying. We've tried to manage the problem for the last few years. So on that note, and you mentioned the dichotomy between maximum support and maximum pressure. One of the things that we advocate for is enforcing oil and petrochemical sanctions. I think a lot of people would ask, how does that fall under maximum support?
Well, this is really where you have to have the proper time horizon and to know what success looks like and how to translate one success into another success. Ironically, there are still people in this town. I literally, I'm not going to say from where, but I came from a meeting before, right before I came here, where again, the old tropes of maximum pressure doesn't work, maximum pressure does. All of these old tropes still exist. If this was with any other country, I feel like in the world, and it had an economic policy, sanctions enforcement, towards a national security problem, you would use economic measures to define the success or the failure. But for some reason, that's not happening here with Iran. It's not GDP, it's not inflation, it's not oil sales, it's not ability to access foreign exchange.
Military expenditure.
Yeah, it's not military expenditure. It's not any of these things for some reason. And then you don't even have to take it from you and I. You can take it from the horse's mouth. Even under the peak period of the Trump unilateral, and I'll stress that, sanctions enforcement, which brought back macroeconomic pain in record time alone, whereas you had that pain before, prior to the nuclear deal, multilaterally, and it took about a decade to build, the U.S. did this in about a little under 2 years and alone. And 3 times Iran's oil minister at that time, Bijan Namdar Zanganeh, and 1 time former President Rouhani, in essence, talked about the weight of the unilateral sanctions on them, on this regime, being greater than the weight or the pain generated during the Iran-Iraq war. And, unfortunately, this war has been forgotten in Washington. It has many lessons for national security decision makers, and it's really the blueprint for war making and deal making and peacemaking and much with the Islamic Republic. But beyond that, this is the inception point for the Islamic Republic's political and religious and military elite. Look at most of the people who are running for president today. They to some degree, were war veterans or had some kind of service in the war. Look at the people who are at the helm of the Islamic Republic's military establishment today. They cut their teeth on that issue. Every threat we face from Iran today was somehow created or resurrected during that war. They resurrected the nuclear program during the war. They went to procure ballistic missiles from Syria, Libya, and North Korea during the war, and today they are the biggest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. Even the drone issue, I think the first drone use by Iran was in 1985 or 1986. Everything that we face, the threats to freedom of navigation, the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, that happened en masse with the oil issue then. So suffice to say, if they are telling you your maximum pressure policy did more against us than all of this war, which in their psyche is like World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and our Iraq War all rolled into one, and we push away from that and we say no, maximum pressure failed, we do ourselves a disservice. And so we need to be able to diagnose how effective policies are based on the nature. Are military tools militarily effective? Are economic tools economically effective? And the reason oil and petrochemicals, sorry this was such a long-winded way, is that these form the major export revenues of the government of the Islamic Republic. And if you're looking for peaceful ways to foster inter-elite competition between each other, what you want to do is to shrink the pie and to continuously shrink the pie, such that the elite will become in the short term more cohesive, as we saw under max pressure. But you continue to shrink the pie, and that cohesion will turn to conflict. And one of my biggest qualms with Washington is this ability to do something for a long period of time. If we had let a lot of those sanctions run, it would have produced the conditions of a crisis under which the Islamic Republic would have made a mistake. And when your adversary is making a mistake, I think there's a Napoleon quote to this effect, never interrupt your adversary when they're making a mistake. It's to put the regime on the defensive, to make the mistakes, and to let us capitalize on those mistakes.
Unfortunately, we shift directions that I would argue maybe we did go against that advice. Two of the more important things and more talked about things that we recommend: one, providing internet access to labor strike funds. Let's start with the internet access. You talked a little about accountability in some sense. How do we start with the internet access? Does it need to start with finding out what we did, what we were able to accomplish in this last round of protests? There was so much talk about bringing Starlink into Iran, VPN usage. We've talked to people inside Iran about VPNs. How do we figure out what happened, what we were actually able to accomplish, and then what needs to change to do it better?
Well, I think we really need a public-private partnership for the tech side with Iran moving forward. And so that means the Googles, the Facebooks, the Metas, all of the independent VPN providers need to be in better contact with the public sector, and then they need to all be in either contact with the Iranian diaspora or people in the national security expert kind of decision-making mode to be able to have a holistic discussion as to what are you trying to achieve, under what conditions can you best achieve it, and when you have success, what then? And then I think all of these constituencies should know something about the way the society has used technology in the past. Look at, for example, the satellite issue in Iran. Satellites technically are still illegal, but you had such a supply coming in that the active enforcement of a lot of these satellite dishes and the cheapness under which these satellites could be produced made it such that even there were so many stories in the early Ahmadinejad era of the IRGC selling people satellites back on the black market just to make a buck. You want to create the conditions under which the regime understands that it has lost and that it has to be the one to try to manage rather than try to solve and stem the flow. And I don't know much about Starlink. I know there was a lot of discussions about it in the fall of 2022, and then someone had actually sent me a picture of allegedly what was the first Starlink terminal smuggled into Iran in the fall of that year as well. This needs to be able to be done at scale. And so the same smuggling routes that people found ways to get satellites in, you need to have a public-private partnership plus some kind of local assets to be able to bring this stuff in. And this is a place where you've seen the producer or the head of that company, Elon Musk, be willing to take a lot of risks with Internet for Ukraine. Unfortunately, now there's a very interesting story permeating on a couple of different platforms on the ability of Elon Musk to actually provide Starlink terminals to these tribes that have not had internet or media in the Amazon. I think a better use, with immense respect to Elon Musk, a better use of his time and his resources would be to find ways to get these into the hands of the Iranian people instead. I'm all for interesting, social science studies, but the things that are happening with those terminals in these Amazon tribes may not be the best return on your investment. And again, this is one of those few areas, because tech often is as much a tool against the regime as it can be for the regime. Right now, the provision of internet and the people who can get creative and down and dirty on finding ways to get satellite internet and finding ways to have more and more VPNs and finding ways to actually, there's space to commend even the current administration. Just a few weeks ago, there was a tweaking of some of these waivers to make sure that you can still have VPNs into Iran. And you have to be very careful with those people who are tweaking the waivers, because oftentimes these are fronts or kind of Trojan horses by tech companies to be able to find ways to empower the element of quote-unquote civil society that they like, which is usually tied to one element of the regime. That's either some kind of nascent IRGC support for some kind of tech startup in Iran. You can look at the Iranian version of Uber and follow the politics of that story there, which I think is called Snap, if I'm not mistaken. And then the other side of the equation, which is fundamentally tapping into some kind of almost deceased element of a reformist argument for, what's left of civil society and you should empower us. I think finally this time the VPN story and the provision of this waiver may have gotten around those two gigantic potholes, and these are areas where we can scale up. So this is the part where we need the best and the brightest of the diaspora, of the public sector, of the private sector, and the people with the expertise on Iran to sit down and hash this out, because this is in all of their interests, because it is fundamentally not in the interest of the Islamic Republic.
One of the more interesting things I heard talking to people inside Iran about the internet was there were VPN services that just on their own provided discounts to Iranians during the protests, just out of their goodwill, because they were trying to help provide internet access. Imagine what they could have done with the U.S. being involved in that effort. Now, the other part of it, I've been in touch with some activists, some of the Mass Act people, some other people about upcoming Iran internet bills. And as you said, it's extremely important for the experts within that sect, the diaspora, to also be involved here. And this needs to be on the leading side of technology. So new technologies coming up there. They were speaking about direct-to-cell technology. I'm unfamiliar with some of these things, but it's extremely important. Beyond Starlink, beyond satellite, what we're able to do more subtly, more tactfully.
And if it's a legal problem, there are legal issues. For every legal problem, there's a legal solution. And if it's a matter of network and whatnot, let's say the quiet part out loud. Some of this stuff does have to be done with government support and kind of covert intelligence support. I mean, otherwise, how does one expect a population that is being downtrodden and dispossessed of their own rights the ability to get around both the iron curtain that is digital and the iron curtain that is physical that the regime is putting around against them? And to add a sense of urgency to this problem, there's all this talk of the regime trying to create, especially with Chinese help, a halal internet. And we talk about this in this maximum support document, or this maximum support memo. It's kind of a race against time, as the regime is trying to create a national intranet. For example, there are regime websites today that you cannot access from outside of Iran. Conversely, there's a whole series of things that are being moved to a .ir domain. These are little wars that we have to keep our eyes on, and we're going to need government support for it.
You mentioned the covert influence, covert.
Oh, boy.
I wasn't sure we would go here, but one of the things we call for is for the U.S. to develop a sort of regime elite defection program. I think as soon as you mention a covert influence or any sort of covert factor in this, people think like 1953 coup, narrative kind of things. How do you shift it away from that, and why would this be so important? Before we can go into how to actually do it.
Well, let's just zoom out. Intelligence is a tool, and information is a domain. Before you even move into and I'm not some operative, but before you move into this domain, you have to understand that the regime tries to weaponize the information space. And they are trying quite a bit, and particularly in English, and not just the information space, but through misinformation and disinformation. You don't have to take my word. You can look at attempts via Microsoft, via Facebook, for political influence peddling, for election interference in multiple countries around the world, but particularly in the United States, even in 2020, for example. Look at the DNI reporting on this stuff. These are areas where the Islamic Republic is active. And if one is looking at the range of American policy tools, right, this is a conversation about Western, particularly American policy. Almost everything that is done in the policy world is put into this paradigm or this acronym that you hear often called DIME. Diplomacy, where it's like diplomatic and political. There's informational or intelligence, the I. The M is for military, and the E is for economic and financial. If you pretend the I in that paradigm does not exist, you are willingly handicapping yourself and ceding the terrain and ceding the domain to the adversary who has a lot of interest and a growing capability in this space. So, without even having to touch any of those third or fourth rails, let's just look at it this way. We have these tools, they have those tools. If you choose not to use this tool in any way that we can discuss the contours of this tool. Not even related to regime defection, not even related to any kind of influence operation, but looking at this tool, if you don't find a way to break through the information barrier and to also play the kind of shadow war, you will let them win it. And you will find that they will have circumscribed the space for you to do the proper diplomatic tool or military tool or economic tool or any other kind of tool.
On the messaging, we can shift to that quickly because I think that's really important. We also advocate for a broader communication strategy for the United States.
Which I think we fundamentally agreed, and I think this would be good for the audience to know. This is where the precursor to the R, where we discussed 10 points for maximum pressure, comes from. And perhaps if there's anything Washington can or should do, step number 0 may be more important than step number 1. It's like those European houses where the first floor is on the bottom, or 0 to 1. Step number 0 is do no harm. Don't do things, don't do own goals. And when you look at U.S. government messaging, particularly during the Biden administration, there have been a lot of highs, but there's been a lot of lows. It's like a cosine graph. It's oscillating violently. And in this sense, you may remember there was the biking, I think it was. It was a spin class that was on Instagram. Or there was all of these during a period of protests, I think in 2022 or 2021. In the past, you've had USA Befarsi, I think it is, on Instagram, which is really a major app to get in contact with Iranians with and to also see this other reality on the ground in Iran. You've seen the U.S. government following drop considerably, and the influence and the engagement drop considerably under this administration than the previous administration. So not using all of these tools, not using everything in the dime, not using the bully pulpit. The President Biden has not really given a speech on Iran or even on Iran at all, but on Iran policy since the failure of the nuclear negotiations and since the early on advent of the women life freedom protests. These are major own goals. And then to go one further, to continue sending yourself these own goals, look at what they were doing with Raisi, with the death of Iran's President Raisi, as if you have a normal diplomatic relationship with a country that 45 years ago overran your embassy, and then you're going out of your way when you know that this is the kind of stuff that pulls the plug or clips the wing of protesters, when you need to be putting quite literally the wind beneath their wings to make sure that they can go the extra mile. These are a whole series of own goals here that in terms of messaging alone need to be edited and trimmed.
And I think there might be a misunderstanding that this is maximum support is a policy geared at a certain political party. I think everything that you've described, everything that we've talked about here are things that the Biden administration themselves could do, whether it's this term or a potential second term.
And look at the Massa Act. Look at the broad bipartisan support in both houses that it garnered. And then look at what the diaspora itself has been seeking to do, not just in America. Talk about not just bipartisan, but internationally or transnationally, right? The U.S. is really the only country that has designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in its entirety as a terrorist organization. And despite a lot of the shortcomings of President Biden and his administration against Iran in the region and with Iran's proxies and Shia militia groups and what the regime itself calls Mehvar Muqawamat, or the axis of resistance, fortunately, the Biden administration has retained the IRGC Foreign Terrorist Organization designation. But there's a whole host of countries,
despite some attempts,
despite many attempts, but thus far, you get the passing grade. You did the bare minimum. No own goals. You did not remove this, even though allegedly it may have been on the table before. This should be socialized with a lot of the other Five Eyes countries, the countries that have the deep political intelligence cooperation with the U.S., like Australia, like New Zealand, like the UK, like Canada. And guess what? I mean, not guess what, but I had recently the privilege of testifying virtually before Canadian Parliament on precisely this topic. Fortunately, there seems to be some good gears being turned there. I'm happy to turn to that conversation of our lovely northern neighbor in a bit. But guess what? The U.S. can have influence on these processes, but the idea to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization and to put wind beneath the wings of Iranian protesters came from the Iranian diaspora in all of these countries themselves. It was the Iranian diaspora that was putting pressure on the parliament in New Zealand, in Australia, in the UK, in Canada, and this is not Five Eyes, but across European Union capitals at the height of political protests. And this is why not listing it at that time, I mean, none of them have done it yet, unfortunately, but not listing it at that time was in and of effect clipping the wind, clipping the wings of the Iranian protesters. Whereas had they done it then, they could have perhaps bought more time. And looked like the West was listening to and echoing the wants, views, and values of their compatriots and cousins and sons and fathers and daughters and mothers and whatnot that live across either a border or a gigantic ocean.
Every time a State Department spokesman is asked about Europe naming IRGC terrorists, it gets very frustrating, I think, for Iranians to see, because we pretend as if we're just not part of the process. It's their decision. Yet there are reports that former Special Envoy for Iran, Rob Malley, was discouraging European countries from designating IRGC as terrorists. There's some
very, very interestingly, his replacement or his deputy or his successor or whatever they call it, acting, Abraham Paley had tweeted one of the comments. And again, people send me this even though I don't have Twitter, so I'm kind of privy to what's going on. You have to keep your eyes on every domain, I told you, remember? People had sent me this. The comments by the spokesperson were retweeted by the special envoy. And there is now this ping-pong game of blame between the UK and the US or the EU and the US as to who is to blame for the lack of the fire under them to engage in this designation. I mean, ultimately, it's a sovereign decision. And guess what? I think some of the best arguments against this decision can be easily shot down. If you say it has no effect, then I have a question for you, which is why do you even have a terror list to begin with? If you say that they might engage in some terrorist activity, then if a terrorist acts like a terrorist, I think the least you should do is to be able to go after their assets. And then if they talk about really anything else, there is an answer that is part and parcel of the legal rationale for doing this stuff, which is to make sure that your citizens in your own country are safe. This is as much about foreign policy as it is about law enforcement and making sure the Iranian diaspora in those communities, in those countries around the world are safe, as well as any other citizens, because there is a new face to the way the IRGC and the Ministry of Intelligence and the regime's long arm engages in this transnational repression. And it's not just having their own guys there. It's not just having their proxies there. It's about using transnational criminal syndicates. So when you look at who the IRGC has been in contact with, Canadian biker gangs, Eastern European mafias, Mexican drug cartels.
Angels.
Yeah, this is scary stuff. They're using more local actors. So you as a sovereign government have every incentive to cut these cords.
And yet, remarkably, we allow these officials to come into New York City, roam around, shop with their big
own goal.
Yeah,
own goal.
And it's still, and this is another thing that we call for is, stronger diplomatic pressure, things like restricting the travel of Iranian officials when they come to New York. We can shift to maybe one of the most questioned parts of the proposal, which is labor strike funds. Not questioned in terms of the intent, but in terms of the method and the feasibility.
Well, let's touch on the rationale for this, just so, because it is exceptionally challenging. These are not even things that can be done with a stroke of a pen or an executive order. You're going to need bureaucratic shifting. You're going to need presidential buy-in and presidential support for when the going gets tough and things get reappropriated or misused. But why do you want this, right? You want this because you want every peaceful tool of conflict adjudication on the table. And the story was, even in the past, even in the protests that removed the late Shah of Iran, it was the marriage of strikes from strategic sectors coupled with street protests that really created a political and economic vector of pressure against the regime. And if you are counting on marrying foreign pressure with domestic pressure, if you are counting on maximum support against the regime and maximum pressure against the regime and maximum support for the Iranian population, you're going to need every domestic pressure vector available to you. And one way to begin to gut some of those oil revenues is if you have strikes in oil sectors. One way to make sure that you don't have the repressive apparatus or the administrative apparatus doing the repression is that they're not showing up to work every day. And there is a lot of strong silent support, even within, from what we understand, elements of just lay Iranian bureaucracy. There's people from the Iranian Education Ministry who have fled, who are refugees, that some of our friends have been in contact with. And they tell you about this sentiment, this kind of broad-based, great silent majority support, when, the next generation, particularly the Gen Z of Iran, has been really not so silent at all, let alone what you hear and see on social media. So the need to find a way to take the street protests, which are unarmed, and marry them with strikers, which can land an economic blow against the regime. This is the rationale why we need this. Now, if there are legal or political impediments to this, then there have to be legal and political solutions. But this rationale is critical because you need a strong domestic and peaceful vector of pressure against the regime that is organic and that can be amplified and supported. And if you will not have this complementary second prong that can land an economic blow against the regime, because the people who will go on strike will lose their jobs or not be able to have any way to pay or provide for their families, there needs to be a material way to offset that. And there's examples from the U.S. support of the solidarity movement in Poland, particularly in the 1980s, that can be useful. There's ways to scale up and scale down this conversation with different elements of strikers in a different trade union or a different sector of Iranian society to test out the proposition. We shouldn't probably go into further detail publicly, but this is a conversation, again, for the best and the brightest from the public and the private to come together, marry that with the diaspora, marry that with people that you know internally, and to be able to find a way to scale up and scale down what material support could look like for the U.S. to protesters rather than just lay political support. It's great to say something. It's great to tweet. But at some point, the rubber's going to have to hit the road. And the question will be, what can the U.S. do materially? And that's why there really is this need. It's the cognizance of this case study in the past, how successful it was, and it's the desire to land an economic blow against the regime today.
I think it can get frustrating because this has been talked about for so long amongst so many people. And as you said, you can't get too much into the details publicly on the plan. But I'll just say it's been very encouraging to see how many people are working on this and thinking about this and trying to find a way to make this plausible.
And don't expect, Adam, sometimes it's good that things are talked about. I don't know why, if this is talked about, people will feel frustrated by it. We've talked about a lot of things.
Talked about and it hasn't happened yet.
Exactly. But, and then there are examples where it hasn't happened, but something similar may be happening in a Ukraine context. It's been fascinating looking at the way Europe has pulled punches on Iran and then suddenly has been getting good on Iran, where at the same time, vis-a-vis Ukraine, for example, and with their sanctions against the Russian Federation, talk about far-reaching sanctions by the EU where they may not have had the appetite in the past to do that. Now you have the political avenue to make the argument to the EU. You did it on Russia. Why won't you do it on a much weaker country that poses a very different kind of threat? And then the same can go for the asset forfeiture. When you're going after the boats and the bank accounts of the girlfriend of some Russian oligarch who passed through London, you should be able to get creative to restrict the travel and restrict the funds available to the regime and its elite and the children and the whatever of its elite all around the world.
It definitely appears to be more of a will than a capability.
Yes, and when there's a will, there's a way. And that's why highlighting the need for this will to exist. And sometimes it's not about slapping someone on the wrist, but it's about giving them a strong handshake. The Europeans deserve a strong handshake for doing this with a country like the Russian Federation. But then the question is, why won't you do it against Iran? This is a country with, how many times the size and nuclear capability, and has literally used chemical weapons in European capitals to assassinate dissidents. But you won't do it against the Islamic Republic of Iran? What's this gap here? What's this delta? Explain this delta. And if you lack the will, how did you find the will over there?
I think to somewhat conclude this, I'll shift it back to the big picture a little bit. I think a lot of critics of both of our organizations and this memo specifically would say, they like to call us warmongers.
To quote the late Shah, they can say many things.
Well, how would you dispel this myth that pressure on Iran, that supporting the Iranian people in their efforts for a new government, free Iran, accelerates the path to war between the U.S. and Iran? Whereas I think we would argue it does the opposite.
Conflict is on the table because the Islamic Republic of Iran wants conflict. It doesn't want a war, but it will continuously threaten and dangle the prospect of a war to win any round of conflict. You can slice this a million ways. The prospects of a war, so the regime has very strategically dangled the prospect of trying to solve anything vis-a-vis them into being a World War III or like an extra-regional war. And if there is, God forbid, a conflict, it will be brought onto us by them. Make no mistake, these are people who actually do use force, and they use force much earlier and much often than any Western adversary in the region. So this is just something to take in mind, that the regime actually has a theory of the case for the use of force. It's ironically been the West that's been lacking and quite lax about this issue. But pushing past the table on this, whether you believe in the use of force or not, that is irrelevant to maximum support and even maximum pressure to some degree. This is about an opportunity, a historic and strategic opportunity for the Iranian people to actually have representative government and for the West to be able to align its head and its heart on Iran policy. And then when it does that, to provide it an on-ramp or an opportunity for aligning the ways, the means, and the ends. If one way is the sanctions enforcement and the means is regime change, the end is a non-nuclear Iran. You can run this equation so long as you have an understanding as what the means are, and the means will produce the end that is both in the national interest and popular will of Iran, not the Islamic Republic, but of Iran, the Iranian people, the historic nation, and in concert with those national security goals and ideological and ideational values exposed by Western capitals, it would be a sin not to act on this. It would be a sin not to put more meat on the bone on maximum pressure. So to kind of put a neater bow on this, the detractors of both your organization and my organization often end up amplifying the Islamic Republic strategy that if you push, you'll cause a war. Whereas in reality, it's been the Islamic Republic that has brought the war closer and closer and closer. And the freer the hand, the more the domestic repression, the more the foreign aggression. And you can just run the clock. One of those very short, 1-minute videos, just look at what the regime has been able to do when its hand has been freer over time in the past 45 years.
Yeah, the data does present a clear pattern. Unless you have some final thoughts that you'd like to summarize Mac's support or anything else, I think that's all for us today.
No, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Behnam, for joining us today. I think this was a great conversation.
Pleasure. Thank you.